Welcome back to Brush Up Your Game. Today we have a little bit of a different video. This is more of a brush up my game. I wanted to take a look at Twilight Struggle, and this is a game that I've played one time. I don't really know, but I was talking to an acquaintance, maybe a friend here, uh, and he said, "Hey, David, there's a lot of things that we can learn from Twilight Struggle and apply them to other games." So I introduced to you David Walton, and he is here to help me and help all of us brush up our game. So, David, welcome.
No, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am looking forward to this. This Twilight Struggles a game. I love the concept of this game. Like I said, I played it once. It was probably 2015 timeline, there or
Yeah, that,
thereabouts. And
yeah.
I mean, first play very overwhelming.
I mean, I must have played the game. I'm gonna say about 25 times before I won a game.
Okay.
And it's a game that very much rewards knowing the cards, knowing how the game plays out. It can be a very challenging game for a newcomer, certainly. But I've probably got in excess of 300 plays of it now. I play online a lot. I play in person a lot. I got into the game in the first place because it was when I was starting to go out with my now wife, and we played board games, and we played like Trivial Pursuit and Risk, and we were looking for games that we could play that were a bit more challenging and that were games that were kind of specifically designed for two players. And at the time, this would have been about 2013, 2014, the Board Game Geek number one game was Twilight Struggle, and it had been for a long time. I think it was number one on Board Game Geek for about 10 years
Okay.
in between about 2005 and about 2015, something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I picked it up and we started playing it, and she caught on to the rules a lot quicker than I did. But yeah, I wasn't going to let that stop me from from learning all about the game. And then yeah, it's easily my favorite game now.
So we should probably walk through a little bit about what this game is, what it does, like just as a foundational level. Obviously, this isn't going to be a how to play the game, but just kind of what is the game, what's the game
So
about, that sort of thing.
so Twilight Struggle was a game that is designed to allow players to refight the Cold War.
Mm,
So you have one player who plays as the United States and the other player who plays as the Soviet Union. It's a card-driven game, and there are rather a lot of card-driven games. And believe it or not, Twilight Struggle is one of the simpler card-driven games. You get a hand of cards, and on the cards there are events, and they could be events from the Cold War. So, for example, the Iranian hostage crisis might be a card that comes up, or the Berlin blockade will be a card, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's lots of Cold War era events. And then you get a choice of how you use the card. So either each card has a value, you play the card for its value, and then there are a couple of different things you can do with the card value, like you can use it to add your country's influence in a country that's adjacent to one of the ones that you already have influence in. You can use it to sponsor a coup in a country. So that's like an actual application of military force. And then you can use it to the way I think of it is it's like soft power. It's called realignment, but you're trying to reduce the opponent's influence in a particular country, and that's it's done by rolling dice, but that's a realignment. It's a kind of a less aggressive move than doing a coup. All of the time that you're doing it, you have to contend with the DEF contract. So when you perform a coup, that is an aggressive act, so it makes it more likely that you're going to get nuclear war. So the DEFCON degrades. If DEFCON gets to DEFCON 1, whoever causes DEFCON 1 to happen loses the game. So
Mm.
you're always trying to avoid being too aggressive because you'll lose the game. But at the same time, there's a mechanic called military operations, which means you have to have performed enough coup or war actions equal to whatever the DEFCON is. So if it's DEFCON 2 and you haven't performed any coups or started any wars during your turn, then then you're in trouble and
Huh.
you lose points. So there is a lot going on. I think what's unique about Twilight Struggle compared to other card driven games is if you have an opponent's event in your hand, you can play it for the points, but the event happens anyway. So that's a big part of the game is damage mitigation. I know this event is going to happen. This is a bad thing that is definitely going to happen. I can't avoid it happening. How do I deal with it in a way that limits the impact? So
Oh,
yeah, that's in a nutshell. That's Twilight Struggle.
yeah. Okay, so I've played 1960 Making of the President,
Yeah,
which uses some of that events are for one side or the other. They can happen if the opponent triggers. So it, does this game have that same? The opponent can choose to trigger it. They have to pay some kind of cost to trigger it, or is that event happening regardless?
if you play an opponent's event, that card is happening no matter what.
Ah, okay. So there is that strategic. I'm playing this. I necessarily know what is going to happen, and now I have to play around it.
Yeah, and there's ways of doing it. So there's a card, a Soviet Union card, in the early war, because that's another thing about the game. It's split into three phases of the war. So
Mm.
you've got the early war, the mid war, and the late war. And as you go through, they add more cards. So, for example, you're not going to get the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early war. It's a mid-war card. It comes
Mm.
out in the mid-war. You're not going to get the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. You're not going to get the Iron Lady card in the mid-war because it comes out in the late war. But in the early war, there's a card called De Gaulle leads France, and that represents Charles de Gaulle, who very famously basically said no to everyone and everything. He was very keen on increasing France's power and France's prestige, so he withdrew from NATO, NATO Strategic Command. That
Mm.
card reduces the amount of American influence in France by two and increases the Soviet Union's influence in France by one. If you already have control of France, you can play that card. It reduces your influences, adds the opponent's influence. You can then use the operations value of that card to fix it, to put your influence back, and you can maintain control of France like that. So there are ways of even cards that hurt you a great deal. There are ways of getting around that and mitigating the damage. But then there's the opportunity cost there. If I am using this card to fix the damage that this card has caused, I'm not using this card to deal with, other problems that have been created for me elsewhere in the world. There's also a mechanic called the space race mechanic, which is where once per round, there are 10 turns essentially. Once per round, you can get rid of a card without triggering the event. And you just get rid of it. That you don't get to use the points, you don't get any benefit from it. But you can do it once per round, and you do that by spending the operations on the space race.
Okay.
So, and that gets rid of that card. So, if there's a particularly devastating card, for example, John Paul elected Pope is a particularly devastating card for America, then you can send, and as we often say, you can send the Pope into space.
Uh, so learning how to balance, hand management
Yeah,
seems to be a very important aspect of this game.
yeah. So it's probably the most important thing is managing the order that you're going to play your cards in, how you're going to deal with each of the individual events, which of these cards you're going to put on the space race, and most of the time you're also able to hold one card from one round to the next. So you have a hand size of, in the early war you have 7 cards. You're only ever going to have to pay 6 of those cards.
Okay.
And then mid war your hand size goes up to 8, but you only ever have to play 7 of them. There are a couple of cards that would force you to play extra cards,
Mm.
and some of those your opponents can play, which makes that like a more risky strategy. But you always got the option of, I'm going to keep this card in my hand. I'm going to hold on to it forever. I'm going to wait until there's an opportunity for either for me to send it on the space race or to play it where it causes the minimal amount of damage. So yeah, so there are ways of mitigating, but that managing your hand is absolutely the most important aspect of the game, I think.
So, so let's say you're faced with a hand where you have four four devastating events to your side.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So the first thing I would sit there and do is I'd work out which of those events, if I play them, am I going to lose the game right there and then.
Okay.
So certain events that have DEFCON triggers, certain events that allow my opponent to trigger DEFCON triggers in my turn, which would cause me to lose the game.
Mm.
And they have to be my priorities. Like I can't lose the game. So if I'm playing as the Soviet Union and I have CIA created, which allows my opponent to do an action during my turn, that card, which can't be space raced because it's a one operations card, and in order to space race something, you have to have a minimum of 2 operations. So I can't put that card in the space race. I can't allow that card to be triggered when DEFCON is 2. So I'm looking at that. I'm thinking, well, that has to be my priority. How do I get rid of that card? If I then had Voice of America, which is a devastating card for America, it allows them to remove up to 4 influence anywhere on the board, which is potentially like can swing whole continents from one side to the other.
Mm. Yeah.
Then, but it doesn't lose me the game, and so my priority has to be avoiding losing the game first and foremost. And then I'm making decisions about which of these cards is more damaging than the other. Which of these cards can I repair? So Voice of America is a 2 operations card. Once I've lost those 4 operations, is there a way that I can use my 2 operations to fix what's gone on? And often, because your opponent is playing cards that trigger your events during their turn, if you've got cards you absolutely do not want to play, but you know you're going to have to, you wait as long as possible just in case your opponent triggers something that would allow you to get rid of one of those cards. For example, the American card "Ask Not What Your Country Can Do for You" allows you to get rid of any of the cards you want to in your hand. Now, if the Soviet Union player had that and triggered it, then I can get rid of all of the cards that I don't want from my hand.
Mm.
So knowing what cards have been played and what cards haven't been played has a real important part for hand management. The best example of that actually is a card called Blockade. It's potentially a very powerful event, but also potentially a completely useless event if you deal with it properly. If you don't remember it's coming, then it's devastating. Basically, the card removes all American influence from Western Germany,
Hmm.
and you can avoid losing all of that influence if you discard a value 3 or higher card from your hand. So if you know that that card's in the deck and it hasn't come out yet, you have to hold on to a 3 value card just in case it does come out, so that you can discard something and avoid losing all of that influence in West Germany. The most recent game I played in as an example, I had 11 influence in West Germany when
Ooh.
Blockade was played, and that was, yeah, losing 11 influence would have been a pretty big deal.
Game
So
over,
yeah,
basically.
yeah,
Just because it seems like you've spent so much to
well,
get to that point.
yeah, you get into situations where, as I played the game I was playing yesterday, that Thailand became Thailand. Certain countries in the game are battleground countries where they're worth more and Thailand is a battleground country, so it's worth more than like Laos, Cambodia, Burma.
Okay.
And my opponent had decided that they were going to go all in on taking Thailand away from me. And I had decided that I was not going to allow Thailand to go. So at the end of the game, I had 17 influence in Thailand, and he had 15 influence in Thailand. But then
Okay.
there are other situations where, like a country like Italy, which is also a battleground country, I've sat with two influence in Italy for the entire game, and no one's ever gone after it. So that's just what we've stayed. That's just what it's been at. So you have to be able to read your opponent. You have to understand what your opponent's priorities are.
Yeah.
You've got to look at what their path to victory is, and be aware of that at the same time as you're constructing your own path to victory. And that can lead to situations like having 11 influence in West Germany and 17 influence in Thailand. But then there are other situations where you don't get into that situation and you end up with only two influence in Italy or only one in Angola or whatever it might be.
Hmm. Just hearing about that, it fascinates me because there's so many different ways, or at least seemingly different ways, to go about a victory in this game.
Well,
And
there are.
uh,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, keep going.
Well, there are three main victory conditions. There are a couple of others, but the three main victory conditions are: you are more than 20 points ahead of your opponent, and the game mercy killing, the game's over. You have control of Europe when Europe is scored,
Mm,
uh, and then there is the DEFCON. So you lose if it's your turn when DEFCON goes to DEFCON 1. Uh, Now Europe is quite an interesting one because Europe is very very important for the Soviet Union in the early war phase, and the Soviet Union has the tools necessary to win very early on in Europe if the American player's not paying attention. That
okay.
flips over, and in the late war, America has the tools to flip Europe without the. That's how I won my most recent game. I was playing as America, but I prefer playing as America anyway. I managed to get the Pope elected. Ronald Reagan gave a speech, tear down this wall. I was able to flip East Germany and Poland just before the Europe scoring card came out, so I won the game.
Mm,
And in the mid-war, Europe's actually not that important. In fact, Europe is one of the lower scoring regions, um, because most of the time you're only going to score a point in Europe, whereas most of the time in Asia, as an example, you're scoring 6, 9, 11 points. So, and when you bear in mind that you only need 20 points 20 points more than your opponent to win,
yeah.
Europe with its 1 point versus spending the influence in Asia for the potential of 11 or 12 points, or Africa, which you can also score a high amount of points on, you do ignore Europe in the Middle War. But if you ignore Europe in the Middle War, as the Soviet Union player, you're risking the American player going, right, I've got all of the tools I need now. I'm going to flip Europe. I'm going to score Europe. Game over.
Mm, that that makes sense to me, right? It's uh, there's this multifaceted. I'm thinking even on a much simpler level. Seven Wonders Duel.
Yeah,
Have you played it?
I've played Seven Wonders, but not played Duel.
Okay, so in Seven Wonders Duel, there's you can instant win by a military track and getting the military track to the end. And military
Right.
track's kind of this tug of war. You can instant win by science, by getting so many science symbols. Or if the game ends normally, then it's a point calculation.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
this has obviously a much more complex version of that. but it's just jogging my mind and making me think of that, where there's a couple of these instant wins or instant losses, as it were. But
Yeah,
then
yeah,
there's also the more complicated. Okay, if it's going to go long, we got to look out for these things as well.
yeah, and that is something that you need to worry about, and that's something that you need to keep track of because there are these different wind conditions. There are a couple of others, but those are the main ones. Um, the game also at its core it's an area control game.
Mm.
So you have the world is split into Europe, Middle East, Asia, Africa, Central America, South America. And then for gameplay purposes, Australia counts as being in Asia and Canada counts as being in Europe. In the early war, you're only fighting over Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And there is that, I don't know, the impetus, the tendency, you're kind of encouraged to ignore South America, Central America, and Africa. But again, if you do completely ignore them and your opponent has built up a position
Mm.
in Africa or South America, Central America is more like less more difficult to score a huge amount of points in Central America than it is in South America or Africa. But if your opponent has built up that like massive lead in Central America and South America, excuse me, South America and Africa, then you might be leading by my opponent yesterday. He was leading by 8 points
Mm.
going into mid-war, and then I scored Africa and I scored South America, and I was leading by 10 points. So you can very quickly flip the game around if you're not kind of focusing on your short-term strategic tactical goals and then your longer-term thinking. Hold on, what happens if they score Africa? What happens if they score South America? So you are keeping a lot of plates spinning at the same time in order to win this game.
And to me, with my limited knowledge of history, it does seem to be at least somewhat historical accurate in that regards. In the early part of the Cold War, coming off of World War II, Europe was one of the most important aspects of the US USSR tensions. Then you go, okay, now we're looking for more land, more areas to influence. Enter Africa, South America, Central America.
Yeah, very much so. The Cold War is fought almost exclusively in Europe until 1949.
Mm.
And then in 1950, so well, in 1949, China becomes communist. And then in 1950, the Korean War starts. So the focus goes to Asia. You also have the Suez Crisis in, I think, 1956. I might be wrong there, which kind of puts the focus onto Egypt, onto Israel, onto the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then around 1960, I think it's December of 1959, Castro comes to power in Cuba, and the Americas all of a sudden become a focus of the Cold War at the same time. So yeah, historically speaking, that is what it does. And historically speaking, Europe was less important than some of these other places during the 1960s and 1970s, and then became the focus of events in the 1980s. So
Yep.
yeah, it is designed to emulate the history of it all. I'm a high school history teacher, and I use the game as a teaching tool, and
Okay.
have done for, gosh, about as long as I've had the game. I've used it as a teaching tool. So yeah, going on for 10 years now.
Now, see, that seems fun. I would have a blast doing this. Not a literal one.
Oh,
That might be a poor choice of words. I would have an immense amount of fun playing this in class, or even looking through cards in class and using it as a means of talking about how these events helped one side versus another.
yeah.
And
I'll give you an example. There's a card in the game called Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt was the Chancellor, which is the equivalent of Prime Minister of West Germany in the 1960s, and was no 1970s. It might have been late 60s. He adopted a policy called Ostpolitik, where he opened up West Germany and East Germany like actually recognizing that the other part of the country existed. And I was able to say, right, so we're going to talk about Willy Brandt today. What does the card do in Twilight Struggle?
Mm.
And one of the students has said, oh well, it gives East Germany, it gives Soviet Union influence in West Germany. I said, brilliant. So what are you expecting Willy Brandt to do? And he said, oh, is he going to do something which allows the Soviet Union to get more of an influence in West Germany? I'm like, that's pretty much exactly it. That's
Mm.
basically what Ostpolitik did. And he was like, oh, okay. So they already have that background knowledge um, of the events that you're talking about before you introduce them because they played the game before, and that's a wonderful teaching tool, a wonderful little uh, uh, like card to have in your back pocket.
And when students, when all of us can make connections from a game into real life, I think that's the ultimate teaching tool
Yeah,
that we hope for. Sorry, we're both teachers, and I mean
yeah,
I'm a math teacher in America, so that's why I will say math and not maths.
yeah. That's fair enough.
But but we're gonna nerd out about teaching here, where when you can get a child, a student. I'm sorry, I shouldn't call him a child. To look at a card and make that connection from a game and go, oh, so they're going to do something in real life that's going to help this one side in this area. Wow. I mean, what power that had in that moment where you go, they're getting it.
Yeah,
That
and
light bulb's going on in some way.
I had one class, and this is I'm guessing the equivalent. This is kind of a senior high school seniors
Okay.
um, class that I'm teaching, and this was a few years back, but I had a particularly bright group of kids, uh, um, particularly intelligent group of students, and at the end of the year we were revising, and I said, well, you know about the Cold War. Why don't you come up with your own Twilight Struggle cards?
Ooh, fun.
And so there's an event in the Cold War during the 1950s called the Austrian State Treaty,
Mm.
and Austria had been partitioned the same way as Germany was partitioned at the end of the First World War. After the Korean War, the Americans in particular were very worried that Austria would become Europe's Korea. So the
Oh.
Austrian State Treaty, they all sat down, the Soviet Unions, the Austrian, and the Americans, they all sat down and they made this agreement which would allow Austria to be reunited as long as it maintained its independence, didn't join either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. And that's an event that happened during a period of time during the Cold War called peaceful coexistence. And there's not a card in the game that deals with that event. And one of the students came up with this card. He said, right, Austrian State Treaty is my card. I said, okay, what does it do? He said, it removes all US and Soviet influence from Austria. And I
Huh.
was like, brilliant, amazing, because that basically is exactly what happened. And that was yeah, this is a teaching tool that has worked moment for me, and that was really kind of encouraging, so encouraging that I can remember that now. And that must be 6 7 years ago.
Wow. That no, that's good. And see, I didn't know about the treaty in real life, and I don't think I'll forget that. I will remember that for a while now. I like it.
Well, yeah,
I love that.
it's
That's amazing.
yeah, that was really good. I think they added a card. So they every now and again they release a new set of cards just to spice up the game as an expansion.
Sure.
They added a card called Non-Aligned Movement, which does a very similar thing to that, but they didn't do that until they released the collector's edition,
Okay.
which was about 2017, 2018, something like that.
Ah, so your
Uh,
student was ahead of the game,
yeah, there you
or
go.
they went to work for GMT Games.
Yes, possibly.
Possibly. Who knows? I like that story. Uh,
So yeah, so that's, I mean, that is broadly speaking, that's the game. There's a huge amount going on. There's a lot of different um, avenues of play. There's a lots of different skills that you have to develop, lots of different things that you need to keep aware of, and you are hand management. You're dealing with your opponent's cards being played. It's area control as well, so you've got to be on top of how I'm doing in different areas and how I'm doing it. And then you've got that kind of aggression versus not too aggressive thing happening with the DEFCON track as well. So yeah, it's a huge amount of stuff going on.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about the DEF CON status
Yeah,
and the required military operations.
yeah.
So is there a certain amount of brinksmanship that goes on here where you want to push DEF CON kind of as far as you can? Because you're like, okay, I'm going to push it up to the line, and it's up to you to take it further. Because I'm not going to
There's
push it there, but I'm just going to get it real close.
so at the beginning of the game, turn one, round one, it's DEFCON is at 5, which is the highest it can go,
Okay.
and usually, so for design purposes, the Soviet Union is the aggressor in the Cold War. And historiographically, you can make there are different schools of historical thought who would argue that that's not the case, but you know, whatever. The game has decided that the Soviet Union is the aggressor in the Cold War. So the Soviet Union goes first, and they can use that first coup attempt anywhere in the world when DEFCON is at 5. As the DEFCON goes down, different parts of the world are not you're not allowed to coup in them anymore. So if DEFCON's at 5, you can coup anywhere in the world. If DEFCON's at 4, you can coup anywhere in the world except Europe.
Mm,
If DEFCON is at 3, you can coup anywhere in the world except Europe and Asia. And if DEFCON is at 2, any coup in a battleground country will cause nuclear war. So you've got a certain amount of right. I need to work out like, can I coup now? And if I do coup now, am I gonna lose my opportunity later? And then the way that you work out military ops is the value of the card that you use to do that coup. And
okay.
it's a bit of a funky mechanic. So each country on the board has a stability value, which is broadly speaking historically accurate. So a country like the UK, for example, has a stability value of 5 because it was a relatively stable country during the Cold War. Australia is 4, Canada is 4, East Germany is 3, Poland is 3 because they were quite stable for most of the time during the Cold War
Okay.
and became less stable as the war went on. A country like, and this is no offence intended to anyone at all, but a country like Nigeria or Angola or Zaire, countries where there were a lot of coups and a lot of regime changes during the Cold War, have a stability value of only 1. So it's easier to perform a country in the lower the stability value. And so you play your card. Let's say you played, I don't know, decolonization, which is a 2 operations card. And you say, I'm using this card to perform a coup. You then roll a dice and you add the value of your card to your dice roll. So if you roll a 6, you add your 2, you've got a value of 8. And then you remove from that roll twice the stability value of the country you're attempting to coup. So if you've done a coup in West Germany, as an example, you're going to remove 8 from whatever you've rolled.
Ah,
So it's basically a
okay.
waste of time trying to coup in West Germany. Whereas if you're cooing in Angola, you're removing 2 from whatever you've rolled. Whatever number you're left with is you then change the influence in that country in your favour by that amount. So if you're
Okay.
cooing Angola and Angola's got 1 Soviet Union influence in it, you roll a 6 with a 2 operations card, you would remove that 1 Soviet influence, and then you would add 5 American influence to make the 6 difference up.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a. It sounds more complicated than it is, and once you kind of understand how the cooing system works, you understand it. So Because the Soviet Union is the aggressor, because the Soviet Union goes first, most turns in the game, the Soviet Union will coup as soon as they can, and then DEFCON will sit at 2 for the rest of that turn, meaning that America has to find other ways of getting military operations. And there are other ways of getting military operations. For example, wars. There are certain war cards. So there's a Arab-Israeli war, India-Pakistan war, Korean war card, and all of those cards give you military operations if you play them for the event. So you
Okay.
kind of, as America, you're encouraged to play those cards for the event. The other thing you can do is you can coup in non-battleground countries, and that doesn't affect DEFCON, but it does grant you military ops. So most of the time, the game is played
And
at DEFCON 3 and DEFCON 2.
okay. And I are there ways for DEF CON to increase?
So at the end of every turn, there are 10 turns in the game, DEFCON automatically improves by 1 level.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, so most of the time, DEFCON starts the turn at DEFCON 3, and then the Soviet Union coups to take it to DEFCON 2, and then that's it for coups during that turn. At the end of the turn, it goes back to DEFCON 3, allowing the Soviet Union to do a coup
Coup.
at the start of the next turn. But there are certain cards like I think SALT negotiations, which was a series of anti-ballistic missile treaties that were signed during the 1970s, that will improve DEFCON 2 levels. I'm trying to think. The Gorbachev card, which is called, I think, the Reformer, improves DEFCON by 2 levels. That there are various cards in there that say, "Hey, I'm playing this card. That's improving the situation." The trouble is, and this is not quite. This is ahistorical rather than historical. You play one of those cards and then you immediately coup to get DEFCON down again, so it doesn't actually have a long-term impact. But I suppose that is historical in a way of speaking.
Okay. It's yeah. So it's that balance of how do you well, I guess as the Soviet player, how do you stop the U.S. from performing the coups that you don't want them to?
Yeah,
Because that's
and
really how you have seem to have an advantage.
yeah, I mean the American advantage is that America always plays last. So there's a certain amount of tit for tat. There's a certain amount of, oh, he's going really hard on Africa this turn. I bet he's got the Africa scoring card.
Ah,
So I'm going to whatever he does in Africa, I'm going to counter. And because America goes last, America can do something right at the end of the turn that there is no reply to, that kind of sets it up for the next round, the next turn. So uh, the Americans do have that advantage, but that's a little bit more difficult to play than I can guarantee that every turn I will get a coup at the start, and I am going to be able to flip a battleground country straight out of the gate. So that there's that kind of different attitude when you're playing America versus when you're playing the Soviet Union.
that makes good sense. So,
So I actually much prefer playing as America because you are making a lot more decisions, and it feels like you've got to be more kind of long term thinking. You've basically got to play the first half of the game as a I am not going to lose. I am not going to get so far behind that I'm going to be mercy killed. I am not going to trigger DEFCON. And you're waiting for the late war when the cards in the late war heavily favour the United States, and that allows you to do stuff like, oh, I'm going to flip Europe now.
hmm.
Um, but you are waiting for those cards to come up, so that's that can be an interesting kind of almost brinksmanship. Like I'm not going to get too far behind because I know that the cards that I need to save me are coming later.
Which is a tricky balance.
It's very yeah, it can be incredibly difficult balance
Uh,
to maintain.
so Okay, so we've talked about. I'm looking here at just the sequence of play. We've talked about DEF CON. We've talked about hand management cards. Um, Playing cards, performing actions, military ops, turn marker. This one says the flipping the China card. Is there anything in with the China card
So,
that's
um,
of relevance?
so because of the role that China plays in the Cold War, China is sometimes on America's side and sometimes on the Soviet Union side, but always kind of doing its own thing.
Okay.
So the China card is a card that's always in play, and it starts the game with the Soviet Union player, and it's a four operations card that if you spend all of those operations in Asia, it becomes a five operations card. So it is I think the second or third most impactful card in the game in terms of having five operations that you can spend in Asia. I think Marshall Plan puts seven operations down, and Glasnost puts six operations down. But yeah, the China card it puts five down, and that's a card that's in the game right from the very start. It's not a card that you need to wait for to come up, and it's a card you can play more than once. When you play that card, when you use that card, rather than discarding it, you hand it face down to your opponent.
Okay.
Uh, and then at the end of the turn, they would flip the China card, and then the next turn they can play the China card. But in doing so, they would then give it back to the opponent. Whoever's holding the China card at the end of the game gets an additional point. And that has won me the game, I think, two or three times. Having the China card at the end of the game resulted in me winning. uh,
Hmm.
I know a lot of the high level players that I've played online are they tend to keep hold of the China card as much as they can,
Makes
because
sense.
the other thing the China card does is you're usually able to hold one card. If you have the China card in your hand, you potentially could hold two cards, meaning that you've got two held cards plus your space race card. You could potentially have three opponent events in your hand that you don't have to play. So that's another thing that the China card allows you to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So yeah, so that's the way that they do China. There's not a China space on the board. There's just a card that you pass between the two of you, and then there are other cards like Cultural Revolution that puts the China card into your hand if you're playing as the Soviet Union, or Nixon, which puts the card into your hand if you're the American player. So that there are other ways of switching the card between you. Um, the There's a nice combination where you're playing as America, you have the China card, you play the China card, um, and then you play Nixon and you get the China card back. So,
Mm.
and you can't play it again on the same turn, but you do have it back for your next turn if you want it as well. So the China card is an interesting and another layer, another interesting mechanic over and above everything else that's going on.
Okay. So let's see. So there's definitely USSR events. There's US events. There's neutral events, and those are going to happen regardless because every event gets played. We've
Yeah,
got early war, mid war, late war. I'm not claiming to understand everything, just kind of going through some bullet points here on the Twilight Strategy website.
yeah,
And we've talked about regions, right? We definitely went into discussion on Europe, how Europe is a little more favored by the USSR at the beginning, that
yeah,
they can kind of blitz it. So it's a U.S. game to hold on at the beginning.
Yeah, there's a combination of I think 4 or 5 cards that the Soviet Union can play in the early war that will allow them to flip Europe relatively quickly. So if they so that that's a part of the game I haven't mentioned. There's a phase of the game called the headline phase.
Mm,
So right at the start of each turn, you choose one of the cards in your hand, and you have to play it for the event. So
okay.
both players do this, and they are revealed simultaneously. They then happen in the order on the card. So if someone's got a 4 value card and the other person's got a 2 value card, the 4 value card will happen first.
Okay.
Um, and if in the event of a tie, America goes first. It's one of the only times in the game where America gets to go ahead of the Soviet Union. Um, One of the cards in the early war is called Socialist Governments, which it basically allows the Soviet player to reduce the influence of the United States in Western Europe by up to three, no more than two per country. So if you headline that card and you use it to take two out of Italy, because usually America starts with three uh, influence in Italy. So you use it to take two out of Italy, one out of West Germany, uh, and you start the game with the Soviet Union controlling East Germany, Poland, and you play that card. That means that America doesn't have control of West Germany or Italy.
Mm,
Then in your first coup, right at the start of the game, you coup Italy. So Italy, usually, if it's only got one American influence in, is going to switch hands to the Soviet Union if they do a coup with a large enough operations value in the round one card play. Uh, you've then got a card called the De Gaulle card, which allows you access to France. And there's another card called Suez Crisis, which removes American influence from the United Kingdom, France, and Israel. Uh, if you've got the blockade card in your hand, the Berlin blockade, that one can allow you to remove all American influence from West Germany as well. So a combination of coupping Italy, removing influence in West Germany by using blockade, and removing American influence in the UK and in France by a combination of Suez Crisis and de Gaulle means that the Soviet Union can just steamroll through Europe very, very quickly with the right combination of cards in round one or in round the first couple of rounds. And then when Europe is scored, if you have control of every battleground country in Europe, which is East Germany, West Germany, Poland, Italy, and France, you win the game. And it's not a you get 20 points. It's you win the game. You just won. You've won. There's nothing your opponent can do. You've won the game. The reverse of that is true in the late war with a combination of cards like John Paul II elected Pope, Solidarity, Tear Down This Wall, Chernobyl, which is a card that, again, this is a historically wonderful card where um, the to simulate the effects of the nuclear disaster, the Soviet Union is not allowed to add any influence into a particular region. So Europe in this case, you can completely stop the Soviet Union from reacting to your assault on Europe by playing Chernobyl and forcing them not to add any influence to Europe. So
mm, okay.
in the early war, it's the Russian steamroller, and then in the late war, it's the American steamroller.
I okay. I, so it takes a bit of a confluence of events for that all to happen.
It does, yeah. And you, I mean, I haven't yet been able to do it all in the first turn. I think the earliest I've done it is the round one of turn two. I've
Okay.
won by having Europe control, but it takes a bit of setting up. You need to basically you need to say to yourself, I am doing this. This is my path to victory, and it's potentially quite a risky one because if it doesn't come off for whatever reason, you are you are in a bit of a pickle.
Hmm. I can imagine because you've put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah,
and to lose that, your opponent's established presences, dominations in other continents, and
yeah,
gone
and
through a lot of different control.
there are a couple of ways. I mean, usually you have to play the scoring cards, but there are a couple of ways that you can, even if you've got a scoring card, you can avoid playing it. And if you if you're in that situation where you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to win. I know he's got the Europe card. He's definitely got the Europe card. He's going to have to score Europe. I've got Europe control. I'm going to win the game. And then he plays a card that allows him to discard Europe scoring from his hand. They're like, oh, I'm guessing I'm not winning then. I guess I've lost this game because you have put all of that effort into one area.
Mm.
And in many ways, it's better not to concentrate on that. But if the cards appear in the right order, if you're lucky enough to get them, then it is a route to victory. I've had games in the past where I've been heavily behind. I've been 14, 15 points behind coming into the late war, and I've gone, hold on, I think I can win this by flipping Europe right at the very last. Because if I control Europe on final scoring, I win the game.
Okay. And so in final scoring, does everything get scored and then you figure out who wins?
Yeah, so final scoring, you would score all of the regions and the China card, and then you'd work out. So they're all scored effectively simultaneously.
Okay.
So if you scored Asia first and you're 20 points ahead of your opponent at that point, that the game doesn't end on final scoring. So you score everything simultaneously, and then whoever's ahead wins. If it's a tie, then I believe the rules say if it's a tie at the end of the game, America wins. Because America did in reality win the Cold War, but I haven't had that turn up yet. So
Okay.
yeah,
So I would assume you'd look at Europe first and go, "Oh, does somebody control it?"
yeah. I mean that's the easiest way of doing it.
Yeah.
So well, I've got Europe control, so you know I'm definitely going to win this game. Uh, doesn't matter what you've scored elsewhere. I'm going to win because I've got Europe control.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting mechanic as well, the way that they do domination, control, and presence. So, if having control of a country in a region gives you presence in that region, uh, to get control, you have to have more battleground countries than your opponent and more countries in total than your opponent. So, if you were unable to get the battleground countries, you could just take all of the other countries in a particular region, and that would then allow you to not lose. Um, uh, and then domination is all battleground countries in a region, which is difficult to do. And then most often that happens in the case of Africa and South America, are the two where it's easiest for someone to get domination. Whereas Asia, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 battleground countries, it's more difficult to do because there's so many battleground countries.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Because I've got a map pulled up here too. That's so okay. So again, presence is you have to have at least one battleground country.
it's one country. It doesn't have to be a
Oh, one
battleground country.
country. Okay.
Yeah,
And then domination, you said was
it's more battlegrounds than your opponent and more countries than your opponent.
okay. So essentially a majority,
Yeah,
but of all things.
yeah.
And then control is all battlegrounds and at least a majority of all of total countries.
I think, and I might be wrong here, but I think to have control, you just have to have all the battlegrounds.
Oh, okay.
Then because that most often comes up in South America, where there are 4 battlegrounds in South America, and they're quite difficult to get to. So I do know there have been situations where um, someone has all 4 battlegrounds, but no non-battleground countries in South America, and they still get control. But it's quite easy to break control in that situation because you just need to make it so that they don't have all four, and they go rather than from control to domination, they go right down to presence because they haven't got a non-battleground country, or they haven't got a more countries in total
Okay.
than the opponent.
And we don't need to hash out all the specifics. That's for
Yeah,
somebody to do when they're playing the game and figuring that
yeah,
all out.
yeah,
But no, it just, I mean, that I guess that's part of the strategy of how do you not lose? How do you set yourself up to win, and or score points?
yeah.
It's all of that is very valuable, and I appreciate like Southeast Asia has a sub score of points where you
Yeah.
get.
So, uh, for their own reasons, the designers of the game did not make Vietnam a battleground country.
Mm,
And this is quite controversial because, as I'm sure you're aware, Vietnam was perhaps the most important battleground of the Cold War. Um, in order to kind of make up for the fact that they didn't make Vietnam a battleground country, there are three cards in the game that specifically deal with the Vietnam War,
okay.
and one of them is Southeast Asia scoring, because part of the impact of the Vietnam War was in the introduction of communism to both Laos and Cambodia. And one of the reasons that the Americans were so heavily involved in the Vietnam War in the first place was because they feared uh, the domino effect knocking Thailand to the Soviet Union, because Thailand was a very strong anti-communist bulwark in that region. So the Southeast Asia scoring is designed to show the impact of the Vietnam War on Vietnam and the surrounding countries. So Southeast Asia is the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and Thailand. And that's the only scoring card that only comes up once.
Okay. That's So the other regions come up twice then? More than twice?
So in the early war, the scoring cards Europe, Asia, and Middle East are all in the deck.
Okay.
And the number of cards in the deck means that they're all guaranteed to come up in turn one, two, or three. And there is a chance, because there is a reshuffle in turn three, that they come up twice in turn one, two, and three. In the Middle War, they then add Africa, South America, Central America, and Southeast Asia to the deck. And again, that they should all come up at some point before the reshuffle in. I think the reshuffle's in turn seven, and then so there's it's turn seven or
Yeah.
turn eight. There's another reshuffle, and so they potentially could come up again. So there's a certain amount of random element, as you don't know which cards are going to come up and be scored more than once,
Got it.
because there's a chance that none of them could. There's also a chance that all of them could. Um, I think I think it's yes, it's guaranteed that Europe, Asia, and the Middle East come up more than once, because there is a reshuffle in turn 10, which means that those three cards will definitely have been played twice.
Hmm.
Because if you have it in your hand, you have to play it, apart from a very small number of exceptions. So, yeah. So that the Europe, Middle East, and Asia will come up, at, at, guaranteed to come up at least twice and maybe three times, whereas South America, Central America, and Africa guaranteed to come up once but might come up twice, and then everything comes up on final scoring.
Okay. Well, it seems as if there's a very strong amount of strategy in this game, but also of tactical play. Right? You got to know
Absolutely, yeah,
what you got to have a bit of a long term game plan on both sides. I would think probably more so on the U.S. from what you've told me.
Yeah, I think the US, you need to be sitting there in awareness of what could happen and what cards the Soviet Union could play, and make sure that you've got an answer. So, if you're playing America in the early war, what three operations card am I going to discard if blockade comes out? But also, I mean, from the Soviet Union, they have to worry and they have to be aware of CIA created, because that is the most often way that the Soviet Union loses the game in the early war is they are forced to play CIA created when DEFCON is at 2. And because CIA created allows the American player to perform a coup, that potentially could drag DEFCON down to 2. And because it was the Soviet Union's player, it was their turn when they played the card, then the ensuing nuclear war is on them. So you need to be aware of that, particularly in the early war. There is an equivalent card for the Soviet Union, but the American player has more ways of getting rid of cards from their hand than the Soviet Union player does. So I guess the Soviet Union player is encouraged to be more aggressive and is encouraged to be more confrontational, but doesn't have the same safety net that the American player has.
Okay.
So it's a very asymmetrical game, and the experience as playing as the Soviet Union, the experience as playing as America is very very different.
Mm. As you would hope, right? It's
Yeah,
if you're looking for balanced and equal, and we're all going to have the same opportunities in this game to win, this is not the game for you.
yeah,
This is a
absolutely. This is
game where it's and I'm even speaking from my one play. David can speak to it more, but this is a game where you got to figure out your side and your path to victory, and you're going to be doing things very differently than your opponent.
absolutely.
You might be playing on the same board, but this is almost like one of you is playing. Well, you're both playing chess, but you're playing two very, very different games of chess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very very different games that um, you're playing a very different game than your opponent throughout
Uh,
the entire game.
I guess random curiosity: how much do you value the space race? I understand it's a place you can dump a card, bury a
Yeah,
card, but
yeah, and it gives you certain benefits as well. But the benefits are very kind of they're, they're not particularly great benefits. You can score a certain amount of points, but they're not particularly great benefits
okay,
on the space race. If I'm playing as the Soviet Union, the space race is very important to me. There are a lot of cards that I want to get rid of on the space race, and having that outlet is quite important to me. Conversely, playing as the United States, I have played games where I've only played one card on the space race the whole game, playing as the United States, because there are so many other ways to get rid of cards that you don't want, and so many other mitigating plays that you can make, that doing it on the space race all the time doesn't really bother me.
okay,
Which is again, it's ahistorical, because in reality, America's won the space race, but in the
yeah.
game, the Soviet Union's much more likely to go a lot further on the space race than the Americans are. So, yeah, it's just one of those things, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's okay. It's the game certainly oozes theme, and for one aspect of it to not be perfect, it seems to be okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's fine.
Um, I was just trying to recap here. Okay, so we were talking about tactics, strategy, right? Being able to have that long term plan, short term reactions. You know, this kind of jab poke, see an opponent's reaction to different ideas you're trying out. So that's certainly in the game. Um,
Yeah,
is there kind of, and I don't mean for you to like give away any of your secrets in case your wife or somebody else you play with comes on and watches, but is there some kind of generalized path you like to take as either side that might give somebody who's newer some more ideas of how they could go about improving their gameplay?
So if I'm playing as the Soviet Union, my big play as the Soviet Union is I am going to score as many points as possible out of Asia.
Okay.
Um, and there are more points available in Asia, and you can get 8 points out of Asia every time Asia gets scored quite easily. Um, the game slightly favors the Soviet Union in the Middle East, and as long as you don't lose control of Europe, more often than not, someone is only going to score a single point in Europe when Europe gets scored. So I often, as I'm playing the Soviet Union, I'm heavily going to go into Asia. I'm going to want to make sure that I've got control of as many countries in Asia as possible. And that usually means that my turn one, round one coup is on um, Iran, because Iran is the American access point to East Asia.
Okay.
And if you coup America out of Iran, it stops them from advancing into East Asia.
Mm,
So that if I'm playing as the Soviet Union, Asia is where I'm going to make my points. That's where for me the game is won and lost.
okay.
If I'm playing as the United States, I am very very protective of the Americas, because I don't want the Soviet Union player to get into the Americas at all if I can help it. So I am uh, I'm any card that allows the Soviet Union access to the Americas, like Castro, sorry, Fidel. Fidel. The card is called Fidel, but it's Fidel Castro. Yeah, so Fidel. I don't want to play that card. Liberation Theology, which again is another card that allows the Soviet Union access to the Americas. I don't want them to have that. So, uh, because if you can keep the Soviet Union out of the Americas completely, then you've got two regions that you can score easily 16 points between the two of them without much effort.
Mm,
The difficult thing is keeping them out. And one of the ways to do that is overprotect the battleground countries when you take them, because that means that coups are less likely to be successful, and that makes it more difficult for them to get um, into the Americas. So with the Soviet Union, Asia, and with America, Central and South America would be my main focuses.
okay. And perhaps just kind of let Africa be Africa and kind of,
So Africa's full of very low stability countries,
yeah.
and if I'm playing as the Soviet Union, it's like a very small amount of resources that I have to put into Africa to get quite a solid grip on Africa. Whereas if I'm playing as the United States, there is a card called Nuclear Submarines that is an American event card that basically allows you to coup everywhere in Africa without consequence. So that's my play in Africa. Is I'm waiting for the Nuclear Submarines card to come out, and once it does, I can very easily flip the two or three battleground countries I need to flip to render Africa, you know, of no consequence. I will look at Europe from the American point of view. If I'm behind in the late game, going into the late game, then my play is Europe.
Okay.
Um, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in order for that to to be effective.
To get
But
there.
that's my play, yeah.
Okay.
And if the cards are right, then you can go for Europe as the Soviet Union straight out the bat.
Yeah.
So
So, take away aside from Twilight Struggle. It seems like this game, if you get good at this, or if you have existing skills in the kind of spinning, lots of spinning plates and balancing what's important. It seems like you start to become very good at figuring out how much focus to put on different aspects of a game.
Yeah, definitely.
And for me, that kind of priority targeting of, okay, what do I need to deal with right now? That's a very important skill in any kind of game. You know, you talked about, okay, what are the cards that if I were to play them, I would lose the game because my opponent would get this advantage. That's something we always have to account for. I was playing a co-op last night with my wife, and I said, "Look, if I take my character and I move here, we're going to lose if this happens. So I can't do that."
Yeah, yeah.
It's
And
just a simple, like, there's maybe a 30% chance that happens. I don't know, but I can't let that happen. I'm going to lose the game, or we're going to lose the game, right? It's cooperative. But still, it's you got to have that thought process of, okay, we got to, first and foremost, we have to not lose.
yeah, and that has to be. It's actually a lot more difficult to not lose as the Soviet Union than it is to not lose as America. But yeah, it is that there is that overriding. I need to play this card now because if I don't, there is a chance that I will lose. And there's also knowing what cards have come out and what cards have not come out, because there are certain cards your opponent can play that would cause you to lose.
Okay. It
Or
also, it seems to me, from a relative outsider perspective here, there's a lot of distractors in the game. And what I mean by that is there are countries that exist here that certainly can turn into points of contention. But for the most part, they're there, out of historical necessity, geographical necessity. But they're not actually going to be your points of contention.
there are certain countries in like in West Africa, like I think is Morocco, one of them
Yes.
that I rarely ever see anyone put influence in,
Yeah.
and a lot of the Nordic countries never see any influence in. But then there are other non-battleground countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey that they are quite important because they give you access to other places or they give you adjacency, and is quite important because adjacency allows you to expand into a country, and adjacency has an effect on certain cards. There's a card called Brush War, which is
Okay.
probably the third most powerful card in the game. Uh, Brush War, which no second most powerful. That is easier for you to play if your opponent doesn't have adjacency to the country you're targeting with it.
Ah.
So I can see adjacency being important. Like there's there's two countries in Central America. Uh, One is Haiti, and the other one is next to Haiti, and I can't remember which what it is next to Haiti.
Uh,
Um,
uh,
but the
Dominican
Haiti
Republic?
is just
Or,
not a particularly important country in Twilight Struggle.
yeah.
But the one that's next to Haiti, which I'm just going to pull up the map so I know what I'm talking
Oh,
about.
sure.
Um, um, the one that is next to Haiti. Um, oh no, sorry. Dominican Republic is not important, but Haiti is important.
Okay.
Um, so Haiti is important because it has adjacency to Cuba, and if you're playing a realignment role, you want to have as many adjacent to Cuba as possible because that allows you to increase the power of your realignment roll. And often in Central and South America, realignment rolls are very important. South America, in particular, is designed with realignment rolls in line.
Mm.
So Argentina, as an example, which is a battleground country, has adjacency to Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And Paraguay and Uruguay are both non-battleground countries. So if you have all three of those countries, getting rid of your opponent's influence in Argentina becomes a lot easier. So yeah, there are you can go mad trying to work out which non-battleground countries are important to you. Um, because there are some that are just like Somalia is a running joke in not the people of Somalia, who I'm sure are very nice, but in Twilight Struggles the country Somalia is a bit of a running joke because one of the students that in my class at the moment is very keen on putting influence into Somalia, and that's not actually a great play, but he's doing it for the meme value. So,
Because it's adjacent to something that's adjacent to a
yeah,
battleground. That's adjacent to a
it's
battleground. Yeah.
it's not like it doesn't seem to have a lot of value. I rarely see people
No.
putting more than two influence in Somalia,
Mm.
um, but apparently it's funny to concentrate on a country that you're not particularly interested in. I don't know.
I,
I don't know what the
I
obsession is.
I don't claim to understand that either. But you know what? If they're having fun with it as teenagers, I say let them run
Yeah,
with it.
yeah. I
That
mean, that's
at
yeah,
some point, that's the most valuable thing.
yeah, absolutely.
Uh, because you know what? I guarantee you they have walked out of your class understanding where Somalia is because of
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so I feel like we've covered pretty much the whole of this game, at least at a very surface level.
Yeah, there's. I mean, there's. You can go into depth. You can talk more about certain things. You can talk more about different cards and different combinations of cards, and what's useful and what's not useful. And I could go on forever. Um, but I think for a kind of the value of this game to people playing other games, we've covered everything we needed to.
So, if you'd like to hear David come back and talk more about some of those card combos, absolutely leave a comment. I would be more than happy to have him come back, and
I'd be happy to come back as well.
we can talk about card combos in here. I mean, that certainly goes with other videos that exist on this channel. So it is there. It is always open to continue going in depth. I love going in depth on various topics, but I think here at a bit over an hour, if people are even still watching this, which
Yeah, I
I
think so.
hope that you are. But I think that kind of puts a nice bow on Twilight Struggle.
Okay.
So David, I will give you the last word here.
Well, I would encourage people from a historical perspective and from an enjoyment perspective, if they think they could be interested in this game, to pick it up because it is a game that has been probably my most played game over the last 10 years, and I heartily recommend it.
All right, well said. All right, thank you all for watching, and until next time, keep brushing up your game.